ex-Nazi army officer reveals how female POWs were harassed before every interrogation session, January 1943, Eastern Front. A thin line of frost clung to the metal bars of a German field detention barracks as the first grey light of dawn pushed through the cracks in the wooden walls. Inside, the corridor smelled of damp wool, burned kerosene, and fear. Boots scraped across the concrete floor. Slow, deliberate, too measured to be routine. An aging German officer, long after the war, would later say that these mornings never left his memory. It was always the silence, he recalled. A silence that felt forced, like the women already knew what waited for them. Female Soviet prisoners, medics, radio operators, partisans, stood in a narrow line outside the interrogation room, their winter coats taken away, their hands trembling not from cold alone. Harassment had become part of the preparation, a calculated system designed to break resistance before the questioning even began. It was not an accident, he explained. It was policy, shaped by fear, ideology, and the collapsing discipline of the Eastern Front. He described it calmly, without drama, as though reciting a technical procedure. And as he did, a darker truth emerged. This was never just interrogation. It was a method shaped by war, desperation, and belief. And to understand how it reached this point, we must turn back to the world that shaped it. To understand how female POWs became targets of harassment before interrogation, we must return to the environment that shaped the Eastern Front. The year was 1941 when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. It stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, swallowing towns, forests, villages, and rail lines in a rapid advance that stunned even veteran German commanders. But with the invasion came a reality the Wehrmacht had not fully prepared for: the presence of tens of thousands of Soviet women serving in uniform. The Red Army relied on women in ways the German High Command considered unnatural and ideologically unacceptable. Female medics, communication operators, snipers, partisan couriers, anti-aircraft gunners, and field surgeons were integrated into Soviet units not as auxiliaries, but as soldiers. By late 1942, an estimated 800,000 Soviet women had served in some capacity. For many German officers, this challenged not just military expectations, but ideological beliefs rooted in Nazi propaganda. Women captured on the battlefield were not seen as legitimate POWs. They were labelled political criminals, saboteurs, or bandits. And in the logic of the Eastern Front, those labels carried brutal consequences. German interrogators were instructed to extract intelligence quickly, map coordinates, partisan connections, supply routes, or unit locations. The mission was clear: prevent the Soviet advance, uncover hidden networks, and suppress resistance behind the lines. The pressure intensified as German losses grew. Each failed interrogation meant a missed opportunity to prevent ambushes or supply disruptions. In this environment of urgency and fear, female prisoners were viewed as potentially valuable sources of information. And because they were women, some officers believed they could be intimidated more easily. But intimidation soon evolved into a pattern of harassment. It began with deprivation, removing coats, isolating them in unheated sheds, cutting rations, forcing long periods of standing. None of this was official policy in writing, but as multiple post-war testimonies revealed, it became an unwritten practice across many field detention sites. A combination of militarization, ideology, and collapsing discipline created conditions where mistreatment was tolerated and, at times, encouraged. The Wehrmacht command structure on the Eastern Front was fragmented. The army, SS units, Gestapo detachments, and secret field police all operated interrogation centres. Their responsibilities overlapped, creating an environment with little accountability. Reports moved upward selectively. Abuse rarely travelled with them. A captured Soviet nurse might be recorded simply as interrogated, no useful information, with no mention of what occurred beforehand. The absence of documentation allowed harassment to spread unchecked. The German officer whose testimony forms the centre of this documentary served in a standard army division, not an SS unit. His account aligns with several other testimonies from officers processed during denazification hearings between 1946 and 1949. They spoke of interrogation rooms hastily built inside barns or schools, of dim corridors lit by lanterns, of female prisoners made to wait deliberately, hungry, exhausted, stripped of protective layers, shaken by the environment before a single question was asked. Much of this system was driven by ideology. Nazi doctrine insisted that Soviet women in combat roles violated natural order. Propaganda reinforced this belief. Women in the Red Army were portrayed as morally corrupted, politically dangerous, or part of criminal sabotage units. These labels served two purposes: dehumanizing the prisoner and rationalizing her mistreatment. Once classified as a political threat rather than a POW, she fell outside even the questionable protections extended to Soviet male soldiers. By late 1942, as the Eastern Front began to stall, German units suffered from logistical strain. Food shortages, freezing temperatures, and constant Soviet counterattacks pushed morale downward. Interrogation teams operated under increasing stress. Some officers described a sense of desperation, a belief that any information could save a position. This desperation, combined with ideological hostility, turned harassment into a systematic tool. Yet harassment was not always born of cruelty. Some interrogators portrayed themselves as pragmatists. They believed psychological pressure would yield results faster than physical violence. It was wrong, they admitted later, but they viewed it as efficient. Others, however, used harassment to display dominance or vent frustration. After the war, testimonies revealed a wide spectrum of motives: fear, obedience, indoctrination, anger, or simple indifference. Still, the core truth remains: harassment was not random. It was woven into the interrogation framework. The officer in question described it as preparation, a word he used repeatedly. Preparation meant weakening resolve, increasing anxiety, ensuring the prisoner entered the room already destabilized. The tactics varied by region, by commander, by the chaos of the front, but the pattern appeared again and again across captured diaries, Soviet reports, and tribunal statements. This system did not form overnight. It developed gradually, shaped by ideology, wartime desperation, and the harshness of a front that demanded results at any cost. And as the war dragged on, these methods grew more frequent, more aggressive, and more normalized. To understand how harassment became embedded into interrogation routines, we must examine the broader machinery behind it: the chain of command, the improvised prisons, the documents that survived, and the mindset that allowed it to spread. The harassment of female POWs before interrogation cannot be understood without examining the structural contradictions inside the German war machine. On paper, the Wehrmacht was still bound, at least nominally, to the 1929 Geneva Convention. But Germany argued that the Soviet Union had never ratified the treaty, and therefore its soldiers, male or female, were not entitled to Geneva protections. In practice, this distinction opened the door to a parallel system of treatment, one governed not by international law, but by ideology, command pressure, and the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Female Soviet combatants challenged the Nazi worldview. Nazi doctrine insisted that war was a male domain, and that women who took up arms represented a breakdown of natural order. When they were captured, interrogators often saw them not as soldiers, but as political opponents, agents of Bolshevism, symbols of enemy propaganda, or members of partisan networks. This ideological lens stripped them of legitimacy before their questioning even began, creating an atmosphere where harassment was not seen as abuse, but as a necessary measure. Central to this was the German concept of gefährliche Elemente, dangerous elements. Female prisoners were frequently placed into this category. Interrogators believed women could conceal intelligence more effectively than men, or that they had been trained to resist questioning. Soviet female snipers in particular triggered intense reactions. German units encountered them on various fronts, and their presence fueled anger, fear, and retaliatory treatment when captured. This emotional volatility influenced the methods used to destabilize them before formal interrogation. There were also logistical factors. By 1942-43, makeshift detention sites appeared everywhere. Barns, abandoned factories, schoolhouses, and underground cellars adapted into temporary holding centres. These facilities lacked heating, sanitation, and proper security. Prisoners, especially women, were kept in exposed corridors, unheated rooms or open yards, sometimes overnight, sometimes longer. Weakness induced by cold, exhaustion, and hunger became part of the interrogation framework. German officers later admitted that deprivation softened resistance. It was, in their words, an unspoken method. Historical accounts reveal that harassment was not always part of a coordinated plan. In some units, discipline had eroded so badly that soldiers acted with impunity, treating prisoners as tools rather than human beings. In others, harassment was deliberately orchestrated to create psychological imbalance. Field police, Feldgendarmerie units, for instance, often conducted aggressive pre-interrogation checks, using intimidation to unsettle prisoners before handing them to intelligence officers. The SS, operating parallel to the army, maintained even harsher standards, viewing Soviet women as purely ideological adversaries. Yet amid these patterns, a striking detail emerges from captured documents and survivor testimonies: silence. Reports rarely documented harassment directly. Instead, language such as preparatory measures completed, prisoner weakened, or resistance reduced appeared repeatedly in interrogation logs. These phrases offer clues about what occurred in the hours beforehand. Testimonies from Soviet military tribunals after the war filled in the gaps, describing forced standing, sleep deprivation, threats, humiliation, and constant verbal intimidation. The German officer at the centre of this study described the hierarchy that governed these practices. Orders flowed downward with carefully chosen vagueness. Senior officers avoided specifics, leaving subordinates to interpret expectations. This ambiguity gave lower-ranking soldiers immense power, and the freedom to apply pressure in whatever form they considered effective. Harassment, therefore, spread not as a centralised directive, but as a tolerated behaviour within a collapsing system desperate for intelligence. By 1943, as the tide of war shifted after Stalingrad, the situation worsened. German units on the Eastern Front faced encirclements, supply shortages, and mounting casualties. Interrogation teams operated under extreme pressure to extract information that could delay Soviet advances or protect retreating units. Female prisoners, believed to possess details about partisan networks or upcoming offensives, were subjected to increasingly aggressive treatment before questioning. Ideological rigidity merged with military desperation, creating an environment where harassment was justified as a tool of survival. However, not all German officers participated willingly. Some expressed discomfort or refused to engage in harsh treatment, fearing consequences or believing it unnecessary. Their testimonies highlight the fractured nature of the Wehrmacht, an institution torn between professional military ideals and the radical brutality imposed by the Nazi regime. Their accounts of harassment emerged not during the war but years later, during interrogations, trials, or denazification hearings. Guilt, fear, and the weight of memory shaped their descriptions. As the German officer offering testimony explained, the treatment of female POWs reflected a wider collapse of military ethics. The front was a place where ideology collided with fatigue, fear, and authoritarian control. Once harassment became normalized, it spread across units, regions, and ranks, invisible in official logs yet imprinted in the memories of survivors and the confessions of those who witnessed it. And to understand how these forces converged into a system of coercion, we must examine the subject from multiple perspectives: human, tactical, leadership-driven, and moral. To understand the harassment female POWs faced before interrogation, we must begin with the human dimension, what it meant for these women to fall into German captivity. Many were captured on the Eastern Front during chaotic retreats, encirclements, or partisan sweeps. Their backgrounds varied widely. Some were trained snipers, others medics, radio operators, or field nurses. A significant number were young, 18, 19, sometimes even younger, sent to the front because the Red Army required every capable hand to survive. Soviet women entered captivity with a clear expectation: they would not be treated as soldiers. German propaganda had spent years depicting Soviet women as ideological extremists or moral threats. This mindset shaped their first moments as POWs. Documents from Soviet post-war investigations describe the immediate environment vividly. Women stripped of warm clothing, separated from male prisoners, kept in holding pens without shelter. Harassment often began the moment they were isolated: mocking comments, shouts, threats, and intimidation. Before interrogation, the process intensified. Survivors later described the same pattern across multiple camps: long waits in unheated corridors, boots striking metal floors, the echo of doors closing behind them. Harassment was used to destabilize: prolonged staring, aggressive searches, shouted questions with no intent to extract information. For many, the psychological pressure was more damaging than the questioning itself. German officers admitted after the war that the goal was to reduce resistance before the first formal question was asked. This created an emotional landscape defined by uncertainty. Women did not know how long the wait would be, what would happen inside the interrogation room, or whether they would return to their holding cell. Each moment in the corridor, each footstep approaching, carried a sense of dread. In this environment, harassment was not random cruelty. It was a tool designed to shape psychological vulnerability. The human cost of this system can only be understood through these lived experiences, recorded in post-war testimonies and war crimes investigations. To examine this subject fully, we must also understand the mindset of the German interrogators themselves. Their accounts, recorded during denazification hearings and war crimes trials, reveal an uncomfortable reality. Many believed harassment was simply part of the intelligence gathering process. They did not always view it as abuse. It was a method, a strategy, something they were expected to perform. Interrogation teams were often composed of regular Wehrmacht officers, Feldgendarmerie personnel, and occasionally intelligence specialists. Each group carried different motivations. Some were career soldiers who viewed interrogation as an unpleasant duty. Others were ideological hardliners convinced that Soviet women represented a threat greater than their male counterparts. Propaganda had framed them as fanatics, especially female snipers and partisans, heightening interrogators' hostility. Documents show that interrogators were under immense pressure. Reports were expected quickly. Commanders demanded answers: partisan routes, upcoming Soviet offensives, the location of supply depots. Failure to extract information could lead to disciplinary action. One officer testified decades later that harassment became routine because results were expected under any circumstance. Harassment allowed interrogators to test a prisoner's emotional stability before questioning. Officers often justified it as psychological assessment. They believed a stressed prisoner would reveal weaknesses, hesitation, fear, or contradictions that could be exploited during interrogation. In this logic, harassment was framed not as moral failure but as tactical advantage. Yet many officers struggled with the ethical implications. Their testimonies reveal hesitation, guilt, and internal friction. Some tried to avoid participating in pre-interrogation harassment, delegating the task to guards or auxiliary staff. Others refused entirely, only to face criticism from superiors who believed soft methods endangered operations. This tension demonstrates how deeply harassment had infiltrated the interrogation structure, so deeply that resisting it could isolate an officer within his own unit. Still, interrogators operated with a level of detachment. Most did not interact with prisoners outside interrogation sessions. Their understanding of harassment was often limited to the reports or the conditions they observed. But by accepting the results, receiving a prisoner already shaken, weakened, or fearful, they became complicit in the system. Their testimonies highlight the moral compromises common in total war, where duty, ideology, and survival blurred ethical boundaries. This duality, female prisoners facing intimidation, and interrogators normalizing harassment as procedure, is essential to understanding how the system functioned. And to fully grasp why harassment became embedded in the interrogation process, we must look beyond individuals and examine the broader operational and tactical motives. From an operational standpoint, the German treatment of female POWs reflected the tactical pressures shaping the Eastern Front. By mid-war, the Wehrmacht was fighting not only the Red Army, but also a rapidly expanding network of partisan groups disrupting communication lines, fuel depots, bridges, and railways. Female Soviet personnel, especially radio operators, medical workers, scouts, and partisan couriers, often carried knowledge that German units considered immediately valuable. German intelligence believed women could offer the missing threads that connected scattered partisan cells or advancing Soviet battalions. A female medic might know where wounded fighters were being moved. A female radio operator could identify call signs, encryption patterns, or unit positions. A courier could reveal forest routes used for supply drops. Even a field nurse might know the approximate number of wounded arriving from a recent Soviet attack, helping German analysts estimate the strength of opposing units. Because of this perceived intelligence value, every captured woman became a potential priority source, and priority sources were subjected to intensified pre-interrogation pressure. Harassment, from the German perspective, was meant to exhaust emotional resilience and heighten compliance before questioning. Field police units often engaged in loud, rapid intimidation to overwhelm prisoners' senses. Guards were instructed to keep prisoners awake, deny them warmth, and maintain an atmosphere of unpredictability. The Germans believed that by destabilizing a prisoner's psychological state, they could detect inconsistencies more easily during interrogation. Hesitation, folded arms, eye movement, these were interpreted as signs of hidden information. Interrogators often described harassment as a filtering process. The idea was that emotionally overwhelmed prisoners could be steered toward revealing operational details faster. It is important to note that not all officers endorsed these methods. Some argued that harassment produced unreliable information. Others feared it wasted time that could be spent on strategic analysis. But the pressures of the Eastern Front, Soviet offensives, partisan ambushes, collapsing supply lines, overwhelmed these objections. When frontline units were desperate and encirclement seemed imminent, harassment was seen less as an ethical question and more as a tactical shortcut. Yet, this approach produced mixed results. Post-war Soviet investigators discovered that many female POWs revealed little or nothing of value, despite the psychological pressure. Their silence, resilience, or misinformation often misled German units. This failure, however, did not reduce harassment. Instead, it created a cycle of escalation. As results diminished, pressure increased. This was the tactical tragedy of the method, an attempt to force intelligence through coercion that ultimately revealed more about German desperation than Soviet secrets. Beyond tactics and operations, the harassment of female POWs exposes a deeper moral collapse within the German war effort. The early Wehrmacht, despite ideological influence, still possessed remnants of professional military ethics. But on the Eastern Front, where propaganda framed the war as a racial and ideological conflict, restraints eroded. Harassment of female prisoners became both a symptom and symbol of that erosion. Nazi ideology was central to this decline. Propaganda portrayed Soviet women as dangerous, corrupt, or morally degraded. This dehumanization stripped them of traditional protections. If a woman was not seen as a soldier but as a criminal partisan, then harassment before interrogation became rationalized as part of her punishment. German officers later admitted that such labels made it easier to overlook ethical boundaries. Another factor was the fragmentation of authority. The Wehrmacht, SS, and field police operated overlapping jurisdictions. Each group interpreted interrogation standards differently. In some areas, army officers attempted to maintain discipline. In others, SS personnel set the tone, pushing cruelty and intimidation as routine. The lack of unified oversight created pockets where harassment became normalized. Post-war testimonies reveal the moral tension within the German ranks. Some officers confessed that they felt discomfort witnessing harassment, but feared superior officers or SS observers. Others admitted that repeated exposure to violence numbed their judgment. A few described a transformation. What initially felt morally questionable soon became part of the job. Tribunal records illustrate this moral shift clearly. When asked why harassment occurred, some officers blamed ideology, others blamed fear, a few blamed the chaos of the front. But many described something more troubling: indifference. After years of attrition, cold, and losses, the suffering of prisoners, especially women, became almost invisible to them. For the prisoners, however, every moment was deeply visible, deeply felt, and deeply remembered. This moral dimension completes the picture. Harassment was not merely the result of tactical pressure or ideological hostility. It was also the consequence of a military system collapsing under its own brutality, a system unable to restrain itself as the war turned against it. With these angles explored, we can now move into the crucial turning point, the moment when the system around these interrogations began to break, when front lines collapsed, and when the consequences of these practices became unavoidable. The turning point in the treatment of female POWs came as the Eastern Front began to collapse in 1943. After the German defeat at Stalingrad, everything that had once felt rigid inside the Wehrmacht structure began to loosen. Orders grew sharper, but discipline weakened. Fear, silent, pervasive, corrosive, spread faster than the front could retreat. And in this atmosphere of uncertainty, harassment of prisoners intensified, becoming more chaotic, more desperate, and more revealing of a military system losing control. By summer 1943, German forces were facing relentless pressure. Soviet offensives pushed them back through the Don Basin, across the southern forests and toward the Dnieper. The front was no longer a straight line, it was a series of collapsing pockets, hasty withdrawals, and frantic defensive stands. Interrogation teams, previously attached to relatively stable divisions, were now forced to move rapidly from village to village. Temporary holding sites became even more primitive, and prisoners, especially women, were processed under worsening conditions. Female POWs captured during these retreats often became victims of the shifting chaos. With units moving hourly, interrogators demanded information urgently. Partisan routes, Soviet troop locations, crossing points along rivers, or ammunition stockpiles hidden in forests. The Germans needed anything that could stall the Soviet advance. Yet the more desperate the interrogators became, the more their methods drifted into uncontrolled harassment. The pre-interrogation preparation was no longer measured, it was panicked, improvised, sometimes crueler than before. A major factor in this escalation was the breakdown of authority. Officers who previously monitored the behavior of guards or junior soldiers now focused solely on survival and repositioning. Tracking prisoners became an afterthought. In this vacuum, harassment increased, not because it was formally ordered, but because no one had the capacity or will to intervene. Some soldiers acted out of fear, others out of frustration, and some out of a sense that normal rules no longer applied. Captured documents from 1943-44 show a noticeable shift in tone. Reports contain sharper language, urgent need, immediate extraction, no delay tolerated. These phrases reflect a German command trying to impose control through words while the reality on the ground slipped away. Interrogation methods adapted to this tension. Guards rushed prisoners into freezing corridors, kept them awake longer, denied them rest, and escalated verbal intimidation. The goal was not calculated psychological pressure, it was speed. Female POWs who endured this period describe a different kind of fear, not the fear of violence, but the fear of being lost within a collapsing system. During retreats, prisoners were often left behind, moved without records, or held in abandoned buildings until interrogators arrived hours or days later. In such unstable conditions, harassment became unpredictable. A prisoner might face aggressive intimidation in one location and near-total indifference in another. The inconsistency was itself a form of psychological strain. The German officer whose testimony shapes this documentary experienced this collapse firsthand. He described an interrogation centre near the Dnieper, hastily built in a schoolhouse. Female prisoners were kept in a corridor lit only by a single lamp. Soldiers who were normally silent during pre-interrogation now shouted to mask their own anxiety. The officer later admitted that harassment increased not because it was more effective, but because soldiers were terrified. Fear expressed itself through control, and control expressed itself through pressure on those who could not resist. As German units withdrew deeper into Ukraine and Belarus, the treatment of prisoners reflected the panic of a force losing strategic ground. Interrogators demanded faster answers. Guards applied more intimidation. Commanders insisted on immediate intelligence, often ignoring whether the information was reliable. In this frantic atmosphere, the line between interrogation and harassment blurred entirely. Post-war testimonies describe this period as the moment when procedure disappeared. This turning point also exposed the limits of harassment as an intelligence tool. Under extreme pressure, many female POWs, especially those trained in partisan networks, grew more silent, not less. Soviet training emphasized endurance, misinformation, and resistance. As German methods escalated, the quality of the extracted intelligence declined. Officers who once viewed harassment as useful preparation now found themselves questioning whether it produced anything of value at all. Yet despite these doubts, the system continued. The collapse of discipline meant that even officers who recognized the futility of harassment lacked the authority to change the environment. The machinery of coercion had taken on a momentum of its own, driven by fear, ideology, and desperation. By late 1943, the turning point was undeniable. The Wehrmacht had shifted from a structured military force into a fleeing army trying to stabilize collapsing lines. The interrogation of female POs during this period became a reflection of that collapse. Disordered, frantic, and morally fractured. And as the situation worsened, the pressure on interrogators reached a breaking point, leading to the next phase, the decision to burn documents, relocate prisoners, and hide evidence before the Soviet counteroffensive exposed everything. As the Eastern Front continued to collapse through late 1943 and into the first months of 1944, the German interrogation system entered its most unstable and revealing phase. The pressures of retreat, coupled with the fear of Soviet retribution, pushed interrogators and field units into decisions they had never imagined making earlier in the war. The harassment of female POWs, once a preparation tactic, now became entangled with a far more chaotic mission: concealing, compressing, or erasing the interrogation structure before it fell into enemy hands. The turning point came when German officers realized the consequences of their actions might soon be uncovered. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, approaching former interrogation centers that had operated for months without oversight. Prisoner lists were incomplete, transfer logs chaotic, and interrogation protocols violated at nearly every level. Senior officers issued urgent directives: destroy sensitive documents, relocate prisoners, and dismantle temporary holding sites. But this destruction effort occurred under fire, under panic, and under the constant threat of encirclement. Female POWs, caught inside this collapsing framework, experienced the most unpredictable conditions of the entire war. Some were marched from one half-abandoned interrogation post to another as German units fell back. Others were left behind when transport columns dissolved. A few were moved to improvised cells inside town halls, churches, or farmhouses as interrogators attempted to continue extracting information even while their own positions crumbled. Harassment in this phase became fragmented. Some prisoners faced heightened intimidation, while others encountered stunned silence from soldiers who had lost the will to continue the cycle. For the German officer, whose testimony shapes much of this documentary, the decisive moment occurred at a small command post in Belarus. His unit had already withdrawn twice in 1 week. Soviet artillery thundered in the distance. Within the schoolhouse they used as a holding centre, female POWs stood in the corridor as they had countless times before. But this time, the guards were different, quieter, more unpredictable. Some barked orders with nervous urgency. Others paced with vacant eyes, unsure whether to continue established routines or abandon them entirely. The officer observed that harassment no longer served a purpose. The interrogators scarcely had time to conduct proper questioning, let alone prepare prisoners with intimidation. But habit remained. Pressure was applied simply because it had always been applied. The infrastructure of coercion no longer drove intelligence extraction. It survived only through inertia, a remnant of a system collapsing around those who had enforced it. The psychological state of the interrogators deteriorated quickly. Fear reshaped their behavior more dramatically than ideology. Many new Soviet investigators would soon question them about their treatment of prisoners. Stories circulated within the ranks describing what had been discovered in liberated areas farther north. Some officers destroyed interrogation logs. Others attempted to sanitize their records by removing references to pre-interrogation treatment. A few, realizing the gravity of the situation, quietly released prisoners or transferred them without documentation. But not all acted with a sense of hindsight. Some responded to the crumbling front by exerting even harsher control over those they still commanded. Harassment intensified in these pockets, not as a strategic choice, but as a reflex born of fear and desperation. Prisoners who sensed the collapse of German discipline described the atmosphere as volatile, with guards alternating between frantic aggression and complete detachment. The officer later admitted that this was the moment he began to question everything he had witnessed. Harassment, once rationalized as a routine measure, now appeared nakedly as a symptom of a deeper institutional failure. It had not produced reliable intelligence. It had not changed the course of battles. it had only contributed to the moral disintegration of the units that carried it out. Testimonies from other German officers reveal similar moments of reckoning. Some described burning interrogation transcripts while prisoners listened from nearby rooms. Others recalled transferring female POWs into the custody of units already preparing for evacuation, knowing they would likely never be questioned again. A few reported releasing prisoners during night retreats, believing that abandoning them alive was safer than explaining their condition to Soviet investigators. These decisions reflect a turning point not only in German military operations, but in the psychology of those who enforced interrogation practices. Harassment of female POWs, once framed as a tactical necessity, now stood exposed as a violation that could not be excused by the chaos of war. The interrogators who once believed they were serving a military objective began, in these final months, to confront the consequences of their actions, some with remorse, others with denial, many with fear. In this environment of collapsing authority, moral ambiguity, and frantic destruction of evidence, the system that had governed interrogation practices reached its breaking point. The war's momentum had shifted irreversibly. What remained was the aftermath, the investigations, the testimonies, the recovery of survivors, and the confrontation with what had occurred inside those dim corridors before the interrogations began. The final chapters of this story would be written not on the front line, but in liberated towns, tribunal halls, and survivor reports, where the impact of those practices finally emerged into the historical record. The collapse of the Eastern Front in 1944 opened the first window into what had taken place inside German interrogation sites. As the Red Army advanced through Belarus, Ukraine, and eastern Poland, liberation teams discovered abandoned holding cells, scattered documents, and survivors who had endured the final months of harassment and interrogation. These locations were rarely intact. Many had been partially burned, others had been stripped of anything identifiable. But enough remained: physical traces, witness accounts, and captured German personnel to begin reconstructing the system. When Soviet medical teams examined liberated female POWs, the findings were consistent across regions. Survivors showed signs of prolonged deprivation, frostbite, untreated infections, extreme exhaustion, malnutrition, and psychological trauma. Many reported systematic harassment in the hours before interrogation, verbal threats, intimidation, deprivation of warmth, and forced standing for long periods. The statements were recorded by military doctors, political officers, and tribunal investigators who compiled extensive reports for use in post-war trials. Meanwhile, captured German officers were interrogated by Soviet counterintelligence. Their testimonies differed widely in detail but shared a common thread. Harassment had been tolerated, often encouraged indirectly, but seldom documented. Officers frequently claimed that it was not official, or that orders were vague, attempting to distance themselves from responsibility. Yet investigators noticed a recurring phrase in the surviving German logs: preparatory measures completed. This ambiguous line appeared in dozens of interrogation summaries and indicated a pattern of pre-questioning actions that both survivors and officers described as harassment. Liberated sites revealed other clues. In some schoolhouses and barns used as makeshift holding centres, Soviet teams found discarded notebooks containing prisoner numbers without names, suggesting an attempt to obscure identities. In other cases, burned fragments of interrogation records still carried legible entries, dates, unit names, brief notes on captured female partisans or medics. These fragments became critical in mapping the locations and methods of various German interrogation posts. The impact on survivors varied. Some female POWs returned to their units after medical treatment, fit enough to resume service. Others suffered long-term physical injuries that removed them from combat roles. Many experienced psychological effects that remained invisible to military statisticians, but deeply affected the individuals involved. Soviet reports described symptoms that would today be recognized as trauma: nightmares, anxiety, dissociation, and emotional withdrawal. Such effects were rarely documented in detail during wartime, but post-war testimonies provided clearer insight into the human cost. On the German side, the aftermath brought different consequences. Officers and guards captured during the final months of the war faced immediate scrutiny. Some confessed, admitting harassment as part of routine interrogation preparation. Others denied involvement, entirely. A few attempted to shift responsibility to unnamed superiors, claiming they merely followed orders. But Soviet investigators cross-referenced testimonies, survivor reports, and physical evidence from liberated sites to build cases. The process of documenting harassment was lengthy and complex. Many interrogation centres had operated without formal oversight, and some officers had fled or been killed during retreats. Nevertheless, investigators were able to identify patterns consistent across multiple regions. They concluded that harassment of female POWs before interrogation was widespread, though not always uniform. It varied by unit, by commander, by circumstances, and by the psychological state of the soldiers involved. The emerging picture was one of a military institution that had lost control of its own ethical boundaries during the chaos of retreat. Interrogation practices, shaped by ideology and desperation, had evolved into a system that many officers later struggled to explain or justify. The consequences of these discoveries would shape the next phase, the legal, political, and historical reckoning that followed the war, when the testimonies of survivors and the admissions of German officers would be placed before tribunals seeking to define responsibility and truth. As Soviet and Allied investigators gathered evidence from liberated territories, the question of accountability moved from the battlefield to tribunal halls. The harassment of female POWs before interrogation, though often undocumented in precise terms, became part of broader investigations into the treatment of prisoners on the Eastern Front. While major war crimes trials focused on larger atrocities, the testimonies of female survivors and the confessions of captured German officers provided crucial insight into how interrogation practices had unraveled. Soviet prosecutors approached these cases by examining three interconnected elements: intent, method, and command responsibility. They sought to determine whether harassment was ordered, tolerated, or simply overlooked due to collapsing military discipline. Captured German logs, though sparse, revealed patterns. Repeated references to preparatory measures or resistance reduction suggested that harassment was understood as part of the interrogation framework, even if it was not formally written into regulations. German officers, when questioned, offered varied explanations. Some insisted that harassment was never commanded explicitly, claiming it developed naturally under the pressures of war. Others maintained that commanders verbally signalled the need for effective preparation, leaving subordinates to interpret the meaning. A few admitted that harassment was encouraged openly, especially in units operating under SS or field police influence, but the most common explanation was systemic ambiguity. Orders were vague, responsibilities blurred, and oversight nearly non-existent in the final years of the war. Soviet tribunals focused heavily on survivor testimony, which provided clear and consistent descriptions of harassment. Many women recounted similar experiences: deprivation of warmth, intimidation, prolonged isolation, humiliation, and aggressive verbal threats designed to break their resolve before interrogation sessions. These testimonies aligned with the fragments found in abandoned German facilities, strengthening the connection between individual experiences and broader patterns. In addition to Soviet investigations, Allied intelligence divisions examined captured German officers who later fell under Western control. Their accounts mirrored those gathered in the East. Some officers described harassment as standard practice in frontline divisions, particularly during the desperate phases of retreat. Others claimed they felt powerless to change the system, arguing that refusal to participate risked accusations of insubordination. These testimonies underscored the fragmented command structure and the psychological pressures that drove soldiers to normalize intimidation. The consequences for the German personnel varied. High-ranking officers who oversaw interrogation units faced severe sentencing, especially if evidence indicated they encouraged or ignored harassment. Lower-ranking soldiers sometimes received lighter sentences if prosecutors believed their actions were driven by command pressure rather than personal intent. However, many individuals escaped accountability entirely due to the chaos of retreat, inconsistent documentation, or insufficient evidence linking them directly to specific acts. Meanwhile, historical commissions in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe analysed the long-term effects on survivors. Their reports acknowledged that the impact of harassment often extended far beyond the war's end. Women who had endured psychological intimidation carried memories that shaped their lives long after the conflict. Some became active in veterans' organisations, Others remained silent, revealing their experiences only decades later when historical archives opened and public interest increased. Western historians, gaining access to declassified documents in the 1980s and 1990s, began reconstructing a more comprehensive view of POW treatment. They noted that female prisoners faced harassment not only because they were considered sources of intelligence, but because they challenged deeply embedded gender assumptions within the German military. Their presence on the battlefield disrupted ideological narratives, making them targets of hostility, even before formal questioning began. As more archival material surfaced, the historical narrative became clearer. Harassment of female POWs before interrogation was neither isolated nor accidental. It was the product of a collapsing military system, ideological rigidity, and the pressures of total war. The structure that enabled harassment may not have been designed explicitly for cruelty, but it created conditions where cruelty could flourish unchecked. And so, the final stage of this story lies not in the interrogation rooms or tribunal halls, but in the broader reflection on how war distorts moral boundaries and why the testimonies of those who endured its harshest realities remain essential. The story of female POWs on the Eastern Front, and the harassment they endured before interrogation, sits within a larger truth about the Second World War. Even in a conflict defined by vast movements of armies and sweeping political ideologies, the most revealing moments often occurred in narrow corridors, dim rooms, and forgotten shelters. These were places where doctrine met fear, where discipline gave way to desperation, and where individuals, both prisoners and interrogators, faced the moral weight of choices made under extraordinary circumstances. History often records wars through battles and leaders, but the experiences of prisoners, especially women, illuminate the human dimension of conflict with a clarity that statistics cannot capture. Their testimonies remind us that war is not only fought on maps and front lines, it is also fought inside the minds of those who endure its uncertainty. The harassment they faced was not an accident of circumstance. It emerged from a system strained to its limits, one where ideology hardened perception, fear eroded restraint, and collapsing structures allowed abuses to spread unnoticed. For the interrogators, this period became a confrontation with responsibility. Some justified their actions as necessity, others confessed regret. A few denied everything. Their varied accounts underscore how war can blur the line between what soldiers believe they must do and what they later wish they had refused to do. The moral fractures visible in their testimonies reveal the psychological toll that unchecked authority and fear can impose on individuals. For the women who survived, the aftermath was equally complex. Many resumed their lives in silence. Others carried their memories into post-war service, activism, or testimony. Their resilience, often overlooked in early histories, stands as a reminder that the human spirit can outlast even the harshest conditions. Their stories force us to acknowledge the parts of war that rarely appear in strategic summaries. The suffering endured quietly, the endurance forged under pressure, and the dignity preserved even when stripped of freedom. In reflecting on their experiences, we recognize a fundamental lesson. The conditions that allow harassment and abuse to flourish in wartime rarely arise suddenly. They grow slowly, in the shadows of collapsing systems and unchallenged ideologies. Documenting these histories ensures that those shadows are not forgotten, and that the individuals who endured them are remembered with the clarity and respect their experiences demand.